Andrew Gibson. I'm president of the Online News Association. And this is Rob Weir, who's our presenter today. Rob is director of digital development at the Columbia Missourian. And we thank you for coming out to our web design in 60 minutes. A few things would be, number one, in May we're having elections for ONA Mizzou, which means if you want to be the next leaders and put on events like this, please follow us on Twitter and look out for the dates for that. Also, quick informal survey. How did you find out about this event? Shout out some things.
Flyer.
Flyer. MU info, anybody?
Friend suggestion.
Friend suggestion? Social media, anybody? So a lot of things. All right, that's good. Our efforts are paying off. Also, how many of you are freshmen? Just sophomore? Junior? All right, good mix. That's what we like to see. So please do follow us on Twitter, ONA Mizzou. Keep looking for event dates and the election date. And with that, I will turn it over to Rob Weir.
Hi guys. If you can't hear me in the back for any reason, as I go along, just let me know. I'm going to try not to holler because then I sound really mad. I'm actually not mad. I'm very glad to be here. I run all the Missourian's digital stuff. So our apps for iPhone, iPad, Android phone, Android tablet, the Missourian website, the Vox website, all of the computers in the newsroom, everything downstairs, all the web servers, everything that keeps kind of our business up and running. And I also teach a couple classes here at the J School. Often in the summers, I kind of do this on an as-needed basis. I teach the Vox Magazine staff class, which is the capstone class for people who want to be magazine editors. They work on the magazine, they get to pitch stories and find art and do all those kind of fun things. For the magazine being staffers over the summer, I've done that for 4 or 5 summers now. It's a really fun gig. And then also, I kind of on a permanent adjunct basis, because of the skill set that I have with digital stuff, I teach a class called Journalism 4502, which is multimedia planning and design. So this is very exciting because the course has gotten really popular, and so it's required in like 5 of our undergraduate interest areas now. The drawback to that is that because it's required in so many interest areas, we have to do consent required for the course. So you might have seen an email if you're an undergrad from Sherry Cherry. If you're a graduate, maybe from Martha Pickens, that said, if you want to get into the class, you do have to fill out a little form, and that's just kind of to make sure that we can get the students in for whom it's required so they can graduate on time, and then we sort of fill in the rest of the class of people who are interested and want to see. So this is 60 minutes of what I normally do in the class that lasts for 15 weeks, so it's going to be very abbreviated. And I'm going to try to hit the high points, and I was finishing up this, because journalism, right? I was finishing up this probably 20 minutes before deadline, so I think I've got time for all 60 minutes worth of it, but if we run a little bit over, a little bit under, that'll be cool. So the basics of web design, what you guys need to know to be able to design pages. Web design is 95% typography. For all of the animated cats and Tumblr pages and photos of random stuff on Reddit that we have on the web, most of what we do on the web is still type. Most of what we do on the web is still communicate via that medium of type with language, rather than through videos, rather than through audio, rather than through all of these other things that we can add to the web. And that's good news because we have about 400 years, 500 years of practice with dealing with type, going back to Gutenberg and the movable type and the first printing press that we can draw on for inspiration. The problem with that, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later in the presentation, is that often can lead us down some roads where we make assumptions based on that type history that are not good ideas on the web, that are not native to the web for various reasons. So the other 5% of this is roughly in this order, other design principles, color, contrast, and balance, which are informed by type and which type plays a big role in. Presenting relevant information. This is a lot more difficult to do on the web when you start designing web pages than you might assume, and we'll look at some examples of how, there's a lot of websites out there that provide a lot of information that is not immediately relevant to what the user wants. And then letting your content tell its own story. And this is going to be a major thrust of what I talk about tonight. We have good content on the web. The web itself, just plain old HTML served up over HTTP, is a perfect medium. We screw up the web in our own ways by trying to over-design, by trying to do things that aren't part of the native web, and by trying to do a lot of stuff that is not really in the best interest of the web, in the best interest of our presentation. So sites that are readable in and of themselves, sites that are usable, and that are built with an idea in mind, a clear vision of what we want to do in mind, are the best sites that we have out there in the modern web. Sites that have a goal in mind, that can accomplish it quickly and clearly and are able to do that with a minimum of other fuss are what we think of as really well-designed websites. Sites that confuse decoration for actual design, dancing cats or sparkles in the background or whatever else, and that have problems with readability, that obscure readability, that try to pack too much content into a site so that it's not readable or it's not usable or the information on it is not findable, or that use non-native ways to present content, and we'll talk about what that means in a minute, are the ones that are not going to work nearly as well. So some examples of bad design are sites that use images to substitute for text, or PDF to substitute for layout, or Flash or JavaScript to present core content, to present content that you want everybody to be able to read regardless of their ability level, regardless of their level of site, regardless of the computer they're working on, are ones that don't use native web tools. So before we discuss design per se, we need to talk about kind of the big elephant that's in the room. And that's the issue of this idea of material honesty on the web, that we're using materials that are of the web, that are for the web, to build our web pages. Making things that are on the web, that are not of the web, that are not native to the web, is a big problem facing both novice designers, people who are brand new at this, and also experienced designers today. This is a quote from a really unreadable book that has really nice quotes in it, that's talking about architecture, and the idea that this is getting at is that if we take a material and then cover it up and do something else with it, that's maybe okay. We can take brick and cover it with fresco, or cover it with plaster and paint fresco on it, and we get the Sistine Chapel, and that's okay. That's a decent use of the material that we're using to be able to build. If we take a material and we cover it with something else and we make it look as though it's something else, we run into major problems. The thing is not, it doesn't have material honesty. The thing in and of itself is not honest in its presentation of what it's doing, and it's not using the material that it's made of to actually be able to present the information or present the thing in the way that it needs to be. This is materially honest. This is a chair. It's made of plywood. It looks exactly like a chair made of plywood. It is what it is. It's been continuously produced for over 80 years. And this is one of the first produced Herman Miller chairs. You guys know they're like $2,000 Aeron, all this junk. This is something that's an object that's materially honest. It is not necessarily the most stylish thing you've ever seen. It's not necessarily super comfortable, but it is what it is, and it says what it is. This is a machine that is not materially honest. It's a really cool machine. I happen to have one of these still. But that faux wood paneling is something that's not materially honest, right? This is not something that's made out of wood. It's something that's made out of plastic that has some veneer painted on it. When we talk about material honesty on the web, a good place to look at examples of where people screw up on the web is actually restaurants. So, have you ever had the experience of you go to a restaurant website and the thing is all in Flash and there's this big statement from the owner that nobody ever reads and the font's all papyrus because nobody's ever used that, and you can't click on anything or get directions or anything like that because the presentation's all encoded in Flash, right? Or you download the menu. We'll talk about this in a minute. So this is the Shakespeare's website. This is their menu. This is HTML served up over HTTP with CSS to do the styling and with a minimal amount of JavaScript for interactions, and I'm not even sure that anything on this page changed if I turned off JavaScript. This is what this thing looks like with styling turned off, so I just shut the CSS off. It's still usable, it's still readable, you still get the information given to you. This becomes super important when we talk about accessibility. People who aren't sighted, who can't necessarily see this, which is a larger proportion of users than you would think, being able to access this content, and they can still do so, even if the style doesn't look exactly right, they still get the information. This is a Chinese restaurant in town. They will remain nameless. When I go to download their menu here, when I click on, please click here to view our menu, too bad, Adobe Reader is blocked for this website, and I don't get any of that information. So that's an example of using a format that's been designed for print, and a lot of places do this, a lot of people do this, because it's easier than redesigning, it's easier than pulling the content out, it's easier than marking it up, it's easier than doing these things. But it's a giant, oh, screw you, to anybody who doesn't have the ability to view this content. And that isn't just a matter of, I can click on this, and yes, I'm smart enough that I know how to run, Adobe Reader and Safari. Anybody who's blind, anybody who has difficulty with vision, anybody who has difficulty with buttons or with doing anything with this, anybody using assistive technology at all, is blocked from viewing that content. So the web materials that are foundational to us that we want to use in our designs are kind of as follows. The foundation of the entire web is HTML served up over HTTP with URLs. The idea that you have a location that everything is going to be in, or a URI if it's on the server, a location that everything is going to be in, that it's going to be served up in HTML, which tells us what content is about, and that it's served up over port 80 of your web server over HTTP, is kind of foundational to everything that we do. An unstyled website can still give me information. It can still let me access data. It still links out to the rest of the web, even if it's not pretty, like that Shakespeare's menu. For style, we use cascading style sheets. This is another important web principle. We have fought a long battle in web standards over the last 10 to 15 years and have almost succeeded in getting presentation style divorced from content HTML. So a lot of bad websites, a lot of old websites, unfortunately a lot of the classes you take through do it, they're still training you on, have websites that are built with table layout. So you take a table and you stick a bunch of table padding in it and you stick something over here on the right side of the page because that's what you can do to shove it over here. And then you build some more tables and you build in spacer GIFs and all this stuff. And the problem with that is that it looks okay, but there's two major problems with it. One is for anybody using a screen reader to be able to read that content, you get one word and then pause, 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 image, 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 pause, 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 another word. And it locks those people out of that content. The second thing that it does is that it makes it incredibly difficult to change anything on a page, because if you have a site that's 80 pages that are all built using table layouts and you want to change one thing, you have to do it 80 times. With cascading style sheets, about which you can learn a lot more in my class, you make one change and it changes everywhere on your site. Much easier way to deal with that. And then for interaction, we use JavaScript. And the reason why there's a big asterisk there, JavaScript is far better for interaction and interactivity than things like Flash, for example, or things like Silverlight or other plugins. It's far better for interaction because JavaScript generally just takes the existing HTML and either shows it or hides it. So if you have JavaScript turned off in the browser, you generally are able to still get to the content. You're still able to read what's going on. If you can't see or click on the JavaScript action or the timer, you still can generally figure out what's going on with it. The asterisk is there because there are sites that rely only on JavaScript to serve up their content. And so the sites are among them that kind of fail this material honesty test. There's a really nice site called SciJavaScript. It's a Tumblr site that looks at websites with JavaScript and with styling turned off and kind of grades them on whether they're actually useful or memorable or not. Whether you can still get to the content or whether it breaks. So this is Instagram with JavaScript turned off. You can kind of see up there that that's the web address, right? But they literally use JavaScript to render every single item that's on their pages. And so trying to use that with that turned off, you get no content whatsoever. And I'm kind of picking on Instagram, but I'm kind of not because it's kind of popular. Like sold for $1 billion and all that stuff. To be fair to Instagram, they're an app first that happens to have a website, right? But if you try to share this with somebody, if you try to, tweet your picture or whatever else, it's going to pull itself up in the browser. And if you don't have access to JavaScript, if you're reading this with an assistive device, you get nothing. Okay? That's a major problem for using stuff on the web. That's a major problem for being able to convey your message and do all those kind of things. So the way to fix that and avoid the sad panda of the blank page, right, is to build stuff with our foundation of HTML, CSS, and progressive enhancement. So why don't we do this? We have a major problem when it comes to web design, and it's an opportunity, but it creates problems in that most of the people we have as web designers have come out of some other design background first. This is becoming less true as time goes on, but many people decide that they want to design first for their high school newspaper or for a magazine, or they want to draw sketches or they want to be fashion designers or whatever else. But the formative experience for a lot of people doing design is in print. And so when they work in print, then they bring these materials to the web. They're very used to doing things in a certain way, and they want control over exactly where stuff shows up and what pixel is in what place and so on and so forth. A guy named John Alsop wrote an article on the website A List Apart, which is a big, really well-known magazine for the web industry that runs online. About 14 years ago, 2000 minus 2010, you think that would be easy? About 14 years ago, that was entitled the Tao of Web Design, and what he talked about was applying the Tao Te Ching, to the principles of web design. And this was one of the quotes from that I found really useful. The idea that we hang on to things because we're used to doing them in that way, and we do not take advantage of things that are new to us or that are unique to the material or that they are unique to the web. We really crave the idea of exact, precise timing and exact, precise, pixel perfect layout when the web really doesn't work that way. Okay, and now we're going to start talking about design. Let's take a little video break. So this is a little video clip from a documentary called Objectified. Has anybody seen this documentary? Okay, it's about the, and of course folks who are in my class have seen chunks of it. Objectified is a documentary that's about how we make things, how we make objects, and how those objects interact with the physical world. And the guy you're going to see first is named Dieter Rams. He's really well known as a designer for Braun, the big German electronics company. As you watch this little clip of him, it's going to take about 2 or 3 minutes. Take a look at some of the stuff that's in the actual clip, and you're going to see some similarities to some things that we use in the real world today and in our lives today.
Meine Erfahrung ist, dass die Gebraucher sehr positiv reagieren, wenn Dinge einsichtig sind, begreifbar sind. Das ist, was mich heute besonders stört, ist diese Beliebigkeit und die auch damit verbundene Gedankenlosigkeit, mit der vieles produziert und vermarktet wird. Nicht nur auf dem Gebrauchsgütersektor, sondern in der Architektur, in der Werbung. Überall haben wir zu viel Überflüssiges. Gutes Design sollte innovativ sein. Gutes Design macht ein Produkt brauchbar. Gutes Design ist ästhetisches Design. Gutes Design macht ein Produkt verständlich. Gutes Design ist ehrlich. Gutes Design ist unaufdringlich. Gutes Design ist langlebig. Gutes Design ist konsequent bis ins letzte Detail. Gutes Design ist umweltfreundlich. Last but not least, gutes Design ist so wenig Design wie möglich. Wir Designer arbeiten nicht im luftleeren Raum. Wir brauchen die Unternehmerseite. Wir sind keine freien Künstler, wie das oft verwechselt wird. Haben Sie wieder nur wenige Firmen, die Design, wie ich es verstehe, wirklich ernst nehmen. Und das ist im Moment wieder eine amerikanische Firma, das ist Apple.
I remember the first time I saw an Apple product. I remember it so clearly because it was the first time I realized when I saw this product, I got a very clear sense of the people that designed it and made it. A big definition of who you are as a designer, it's the way that you look at the world. And I guess it's one of the sort of curses of what you do is that you're constantly looking at something and thinking, why is it like that? Why is it like that and not like this? And so in that sense, you're constantly designing. When we're designing a product, we have to look to different attributes of the product, and some of those attributes will be the materials that it's made from and the form that's connected to those materials. So for example, with the first iMac that we made, the primary component of that was the cathode ray tube, which was spherical. We would have an entirely different approach to designing something like that than the current iMac, which is a very thin, flat panel display. Other issues would be, just physically, how do you connect to the product? So for example, something like the iPhone, everything defers to the display. A lot of what we seem to be doing in a product like that is actually getting design out of the way. And I think when forms develop with that sort of reason, and they're not just arbitrary shapes, it feels almost inevitable. It feels...
That's the quote that I like best from the presentation, is this idea that everything differs to the screen. Everything differs to the thing that you want to be the major source of what it is that you're designing. So let's start talking about design some. This whole question of how things are designed and the ways in which the product itself or the materials themselves inform the product brings us to this big word called skeuomorphism. This is tossed around a ton in the design community, often as criticism, often as something that we get argued about. It's really not well understood. It's kind of become shorthand for old Apple design thinking, and people either love or hate the idea of it. So what does this actually mean? It's the idea that a physical ornament or design on an object is made to resemble another object or another material or another technique, rather. And so the idea is that we have used this throughout design to make interactions with software act like they're interactions with natural objects, right? And this can be taken often as a design literalism, and this can lead to some really weird results. So we're going to look at some examples of design literalism. So talking about an object that is not of the object, right? This is a car that's made of metal and vinyl and glass and stuff like that, that has plastic panels tacked to the sides which are painted with wood grain finish, okay? None of this is materially honest. It's a crappy Chrysler station wagon with some wood grain paneling. And those types of designs don't hold up well over time, right? That's one of the problems with designs that are not materially honest, that don't reference the materials that they're made of. This is electronic, but it's the design for audio mixing software. And you see that the designer has replicated the physical knobs on the machine and the physical sliders on the machine in a way that doesn't make sense. From that slide that we saw, or from that video that we saw, this makes sense. The tactile interaction there, you can tell the thing on the left is going to click from one spot to the other, right? And you can tell the thing on the right is going to move in sort of a, you know, like a little, it's not going to be completely loose, it's not going to be totally sticky, there's going to be kind of a nice feel to it when you turn the dial up and down. You know, this makes no sense for the digital environment in which it's in because you're not actually manipulating those things physically. This makes sense because you're touching that and you're moving it around in a physical way. When Xerox invented the computer with the graphical user interface, this is the Xerox Alto? Starting Jim. They used this principle of skeuomorphism to make it sensible to people in terms of what would be used, right? They used a desktop model. You can see that there are files, there are folders, there's like a little inbox up there, there's all this kind of stuff. And when Apple used that same visual metaphor for the original Mac, it made a lot of sense. You're trying to get people to use this thing instead of a desktop. If you've ever seen just like the command line in the computer, ever seen a user interface like in DOS, it doesn't look like anything that makes sense. This made sense to people, and they could organize things in a particular way and in a certain way. So there's good reasons for having this design that mimics the real objects. Then they get designs like this, which is total crap, okay? This is a book. It's on an iPad. I don't need to be told here that the book itself has a page-turning thing, and I bet somebody worked really freaking hard on that page-turning animation and getting the, you know, Winnie the Pooh to be kind of curved like that and so on and so forth. And it's obviously dishonest just by the fact that, you know, the thing is cut off at the top of the screen. I mean, no, you're not going to make a display that will project that past the top of the screen. But this is not the experience of the book that I want to have as part of the book, right? When we started producing things that were digital, whether it was books or magazines or whatever else, and especially when we got tablets, a lot of people in the industry seemed to think that the tablet would be the replacement for the magazine. So they thought that the interaction that we had with it was what we would want replicated in this digital space, right? You know, did we really enjoy about a magazine the moving the page back and forth and getting that like look in both sides of the page, or do you just kind of flip pages without really noticing it because your eyes are moving from one spot to the other, right? I tend to think that it's more along the lines of this is a bug in a book that we've replicated in something that's designed and made it into a feature, which is really annoying. You know, the value of what this thing is lost because we have forgotten to ask what was valuable about the book to start with. It wasn't the pages, it was the content on the pages, it was the story on the pages that we were interested in seeing, right? So, you know, if we think of the web again as a way to transmit meaning and transmit information, this matters a great deal in terms of how we build the web. I want to take a brief detour as well and talk about accessibility, which I brought up a little bit before. Tim Berners-Lee talked about accessibility from the very first specification that he wrote for the World Wide Web. And you see particle fever at True False? A few people did. Remember when they talked about, like, yeah, we built the World Wide Web at CERN so that we could share information with everybody around the world. Well, they actually didn't take up the web as a project when Berners-Lee proposed it. It was like later on that they were like, this might be a big deal. But accessibility was built into the web from the very beginning, and it's why it was open source and why it was seen as a medium that would let everybody, regardless of their ability, be able to access things. And still, here in 2014, we're building a lot of stuff. Think about that page on Instagram that can only be accessed by able-bodied, good sight and hearing having people in a class of people that can afford bandwidth and can have a lot of memory for these big asset loading sites. These things that pull down megabytes of style sheets and images and all that stuff to build what they're doing. This is going to be unpopular. We need more accessibility nuts building web design and fewer grammar nuts in web design. And I'll kind of leave it at that. Accessibility is important, okay? The idea being that we absolutely need to think about the percentage of our population, which is close to 20%, who have color blindness, other visual impairments, other problems with being able to access sites that we have. I spent like half an hour getting that Jeff to work. I'm so happy. So let's go back to typography. Typography has a few ways in which it works. The most obvious of those is that the type on a page has to communicate the meaning of the words, right? This is the type as a crystal base through which the light of the world shines through, and we don't even see the type, and so on and so forth. But when your eyes rest on this stuff, they kind of jump back and forth among the letter forms, and you get this information put into your brain, right? So typography is two things. One of them is the actual design of typefaces, which is a really fascinating subject, and that can be an entire graduate level program or an entire undergraduate program. The other one that we're going to talk about here is the use of typefaces to convey meaning. And that's the more important thing to understand about being a web designer. Most of what we do is in type, and most of what we do is we attempt to convey meaning through our type. So type does several things on a web page, book, magazine, whatever. It conveys meaning. This is the literal form of there are words and you read them and you get information out of them. It conveys the emotion and the tone of what it is that you're getting across. Think about getting an email from somebody that has big demands in all caps that's in Comic Sans and how mad that makes you. It adds to or detracts from the credibility of the printed thing that you're doing, right? It can look more serious or less serious. It can look funnier. It can look playful. It can look like you don't really know what you're doing, right? And then it works to organize information and indicate structure. And if you think about the way that a newspaper page works and looks, this will make a lot of sense, right? There's a big headline at the top of the page, which is the big information. There's smaller headlines down the page that are other information. In magazines, we have title text, we have body text, we have pullouts, we have all of this sort of stuff, and that's just type, right? It's nothing it's not art, it's not images, it's just type that works to indicate structure and indicate meaning. So here are some types of type. From the top, that is Garamond, and then, let me think about this for a minute. It's Garamond, I totally practiced this. Caslon is what that is, Bedini, which are all serif types. And then going down from there, we have got Helvetica and Arial, which are close to identical other than the capitals in Arial, which are terrible. And then very bottom is Radana, I think. These are types of type, okay, and type works in a bunch of different ways. These are the basic types of type that are out there, and they have different meanings and they have different functions based on what they are. So we have serif types at the top. Serif types are called that because they have serifs. That's what a serif is. If you're ever concerned about or you can't remember what that is, just remember this, it'll be stuck in your head. And the serif types are the first ones that we produced when we started transitioning from written to having metal type or having type that was movable, right? Slab serifs are kind of transitional, and then we have these sans serif types, so they're often called grotesque types. That's somehow a translation of Gothic because these come out of the Gothic movement in the 19th century. The serif types and slab serif, sans serif types were grotesque. And then the stuff at the bottom, other than monospace, if you set type for the web in any of those things, I will hunt you down. They're not for setting large chunks of type. They're for emphasis or looking like you're like cool and Gothic or whatever else. The stuff at the bottom. Monospace type has quite a good use in computing because it's very easy to distinguish an O from a 0 and an L from an I and so on and so forth, which we'll talk about in a bit. But the script, the black letter, the display, the dingbat types, less useful, especially this one at the bottom. It's extremely useful for if you need an arrow or a hand or something like that. It's not at all useful for trying to set body type in that and trying to decode. So within the serif types, we've got a few different styles, and they have kind of different meanings that come along with them. And when you're looking at type like this, what you're really looking at is the difference between the thick and the thin parts of the type, and then the shape of the type itself. The lowercase g is a really fun one to look at. Lowercase a, the p's and b's and q's and d's all make a difference. So we have very old styles of type. The sort of Garamond is a very traditional one that we had earlier. We have transitional type, which is a little bit less kind of fancy. There's a few, it looks a little bit quicker to write. There's a few fewer flourishes in it. This kind of modernist type, which is much more angular, much larger of a difference between the thick and the thin parts of it. And then these slab serifs at the very bottom are kind of transitional between a serif and a sans serif type. They work really well if you want to try to pair a few types of type on a page. They look a little bit more modern than some of those other things. And then the serif types we have the old school grotesque types, the Gothic types. Helvetica is kind of like the 500-pound gorilla of fonts. It looms over everything. And it's because it is completely neutral. I mean, this was made in Switzerland in the aftermath of World War II, and neutralism was a thing then, right? The idea that you wouldn't have a nationalistic font, the black letter German types of fonts, for example. You wouldn't have a font that was the sans serif, the stuff that came out of England. It was supposed to be completely neutral. This is why it can be the typeface that is the logo for American Apparel and for American Airlines at the same time. And it means different things in each of those contexts. It's extremely versatile because it doesn't mean anything. These humanist types tend to have much more, they have some difference between thick and thins, which sans serif types usually don't. And then these geometric fonts at the bottom tend to be based on geometric forms, like that's Futura, and you can tell that the O and the A and the inside of the G are just round. So a common complaint about web design is that there's only a few types of type that I can use. I can't make good design. This is one type of type, all right? It's one typeface that has two fonts, the regular font and the italic font. This was set during the Italian Renaissance. There's obviously significant stuff here that's going on with that. So how do you typography? There's a really nice web resource that's out there that I use in my class called Practical Typography. It's a free book that's on the web. If you like it, please give him a donation. Written by a guy named Matthew Butterick, and it's called Butterick's Practical Typography. So the key point that he makes, which was like a blinding revelation when I read this 3 or 4 years ago, is coming from somebody who did a design major in college, and I've thought about this stuff, for 20 years of my professional career and so on and so forth. Most of the type that's on your site, most of your project quality, is dependent on what your body text is, what you set most of your type in, since that's most of what you have going on. And when we think about redesigns, when we think about what we're doing, we often go from the big type first. It's like the problem that we have with redesigning websites, where we start looking at the front page first, without realizing that that's not where people spend most of their time. They spend most of their time elsewhere. The size of the body type directly affects the legibility of that type, right? In print, 10 to 12 points is pretty normal. On the web, 15 to 18 pixels, 15 to 25 pixels is usually okay. This is going to be completely dependent upon how large of the size of the screen that you're using, how big the environment is that you're reading it in, so on and so forth. We're going to look at an example of that in a bit. The line spacing should be 120 to 145% of your text size. That's 1 is too cramped, 2 is way too much, 1.5 is a little bit too much. And there's ways in CSS to deal with this. And by the way, this is all linked. The references that I'm using here are linked on my Delicious Bookmarks, which I'll give you the link to at the end of class, so you don't have to frantically write everything down right now. The line length of something, this is the idea that we have, again, when we're reading a book or something that's printed, we want a length of type that's comfortable to read, so we're not doing this with our eyes the entire time, but you also don't want to have a widescreen monitor where you're reading all the way across here and then you have to turn and come back to this. So the rule of thumb that we used to use for print was about an alphabet and a half. That's kind of been extended now with bigger monitors and bigger use cases on the web to kind of 2 to 3 lowercase alphabets. And then finally, the biggest thing you can do to make your sites look distinctive, to make what you're doing look distinctive, is to not use whatever crappy font is automatically the one that comes with, that's the web safe font. There's a lot of reasons for using web safe fonts. One of them is that they're web safe, right? Your grandma can see this on her old computer running Internet Explorer 6, the same way that you could on your new computer. But with progressive enhancement, with ways that we have of importing type, you can actually import type, use a really nice font for what you're using, and then have a couple of fallbacks. You know, this idea of having a web-safe font or a font in the font stack, to where you might set your type in Caslon. If you don't have that, your computer that your user is viewing this on doesn't have that, it falls back to Georgia, and then it falls back to, you know, Times, and then a sans serif or a serif font. All those things will do that. We'll talk about how to find professional fonts here in just a bit. When you're setting type for the web, one of the really important things to look at is the X height, or the height of the lowercase x, the part of the letter that you actually see, compared to the overall height of the type, right? This is all 32 points. I realize that may get a little bit small for you guys in the back. Scala, Interstate, Bavini, and Mrs. Eves. So these pieces of type are all 32 points. They all have the same optical size as measured from the top of the stroke to the bottom of the descender, plus a little bit of leading. They look different because of the height of those that lowercase x. There isn't an x in that line, but it's the lowercase pieces of the letter that don't have the ascender and the descender that give it that optical height, that give it that height that you would not otherwise have. There's a lot of web type that's out there. Georgia is a really good example. It's a font that was designed for screen reading, has a very large x height in proportion to the overall size of the type. You know, here you see this with Helvetica. This is like 80% of the entire height of the type is the lowercase letters, right? So on a page, it's going to read larger at the same size as something like this, you know, Mrs. Eves and Mr. Eves sort of combination down here. Those are much smaller. The X height is much smaller as a proportion of the overall size of the type. Just for a second too, this is a really interesting trend that's going on right now in typography. Is we're seeing a lot of designers start to cut fonts that are both in typefaces rather, that are both in a lowercase or in a serif and in a sans serif version of these things. So you get, the idea is that you have pairings that will work really well together if you want to mix serif and sans serif types, which is totally okay. There's this myth that you can't do that. You can totally do that. It's awesome. People do that all the time. But those pairings, when you're looking at professional type, are really interesting to see. So let's take a type example break. This is the website Thinking with Type. I'm going to have to zoom out a little bit to get this actually to work. And this is also another textbook which is online and super useful for you guys to be able to take a look at on your own. So let me get that actually showing up on the screen. So type families are something that's really important to understand when you're looking at type. So I've kind of used the words font and typeface interchangeably, and like somebody's going to probably slap me for doing that as a typographer. A font is a single cut of a type. So in this case, this is all Garamond. That Roman style that's at the very top there, the Roman form, which is the basic form of the type, is a font. The italic font that's below that, the Garamond Pro Italic, is a font. The bold and semi-bold are fonts in and of themselves. The bold, semi-bold, italic are fonts in and of themselves. The whole family of them is a typeface. But when you're picking a typeface, what you want to try and find is one that has all of these varieties in it so that you can set type that looks really nice on the web, so that you can have things show up that look really nice. This little example here in the corner is a really good example of why that is. Computers will take type, and if you have it with an emphasis tag, or if you have it set as italic, it'll just take the type and it'll just shove the front of those letters over so that they're kind of leaning over. You know, italics, true italics that you see over on the left side there aren't slanted letters, they're cut differently and they look different. And there's a lot of italics, like with quadrats, where the italic form is upright. It just looks different because of the way that it's actually cut. So there's a fair number of fonts that are like that, that work out like that. Let's go back to our example. Okay, so how do I get pro typefaces? I don't have a lot of money. I'm a college student, right? I spent my last $8 on Chipotle. I need to get a pro typeface. How do I do that? Typekit.com is super popular, and it's got the most fonts of anybody that's out there on the web. The most good fonts, I should say. It's owned by Adobe, and so they have a profit motive here, right? They license their font library for students or professional use through Typekit.com. It's free for student use. You can get a little trial library and use like 2 fonts, but you have to put a little badge on your site that says you're using Typekit, which is kind of annoying. If you want to use up to like 5 fonts and 2 websites, it's $25 a month, or a year rather, and then it goes up from there. FontSquirrel.com is a fun name, and it's also a really good source for free type. Part of the goal of FontSquirrel is if you own some type, like, I mean, not like you pulled it off the box computers when I wasn't looking and put it on your laptop. If you own rights to type, You can upload it there and it will give you the web type options that you would need to use for that, okay? It also lets you download free fonts, ones that are free for use on your site. The caveat here is those are mostly free for personal use. They're not free for use at the Missourian or Vox because those are professional publications. You know, this is something that, that people often don't remember about that. And then there's Google Web Fonts, which offers free embeddable fonts for your site, but it has fewer options than Typekit and FontSquirrel. And the difference with these top two, Typekit and FontSquirrel, well, the difference among these three actually is Typekit and Google both offer embeddable fonts that actually live on the Google servers or on the Adobe servers. So when your page is loaded, it goes out, makes a request there, downloads the type, and displays it in that way. FontSquirrel will let you actually download the font and embed it in your own website, and that's true. I'd love to talk about, but we only have 60 minutes. So how do you pick type? Well, there's a few options to be able to do this. This is a really nice site, justmytype.co. It has a really fun collection of type pairings from Typekit and from Hoffler and Froeder Jones, which is a type foundry in New York. HNFJ made the Gotham font that Obama used all over the place for his 2012 campaign, and it's kind of ruined for anything else since then, but it was a really popular, nice sans serif, and it had some serif versions as well. The problem is those HNFJ fonts, we own one of those for Vox, the Ziggurat font that we all know and love as the title text. I think it was $330 per license, and we had to buy like 30 licenses the last time we redesigned. So that's the problem with that, right? This typograph site is actually really nice, and we're going to look at this later on as an example. This allows you to compare relative sizes of your different type in ratios so that you can see, okay, if my body text is this large, how big does my headline need to be? How big does my other stuff need to be on the page to sort of be in rhythm with that? It uses some ratios that are really nice to be able to compare those things. And then there's resources here that are really cool, typetester.org and then the csstypeset.com. Both of these allow you to, and I'm just going to pull up Typetester real quick to show, or Typeset real quick to show you how this works. It will actually let you take a font and style it and generate CSS. This is super useful for if you don't have the first idea about how to make CSS and how to make this stuff work out with this. But it will let you actually take your text, and I can change, these are just the styles that are, you know, common to all web equivalents. I can change that, I can change this, I can change the font color, I can change the leading, you know, whatever I would want to do here. And it will actually generate the CSS over here on this side that I would need to reference that font to actually use that. So it's super useful if you're new to CSS, if you're not quite sure what you're doing as far as being able to use that for a resource. Okay, we're going to take a little type example break and talk about types of type and see if you guys can figure out what these different things are. So this is The Great Gatsby. Anybody ever heard of it? It was a book. It was a movie. It's been a movie a few times. This is The Great Gatsby set in plain old web type. Okay, this is the uber example of accessible web text, right? Like you can read that regardless of the browser. You know, look at that. If I resize the browser window, you know, it's responsive. It works on tablets. It works on phones. This is perfectly styled text, and this is what I mean by we tend to break the web, right? The web in and of itself will do this on any device. We screw it up by doing other things to it. So that's The Great Gatsby. Now there's three styles of this that I want to talk about and kind of look at the type that's different about them, and we can kind of talk about which one of these that we think looks similar to what might have happened if we had designed this, you know, at the time the book came out in the 20s. So the first one of these looks like this. Second version is going to look like this. And then the third version is more like this. So there's some differences among these types of type, right? We have some differences in the headlines, we have some differences in the subhead. Nice slab here for the initial drop cap, a little bit of a difference here. So out of these, so this is number one, number two, number three, it's like you're at the eye doctor. Which of these looks most like what you would associate with the Gatsby of the 20s? Anybody want to vote for number one? Raise your hands. Okay, one person's 2, 3, 4 people, that's cool. Number two? Okay, some more people, a few more people. There's some like wrinkled noses and eyebrows and stuff like that. Number three, anybody? 3 or 4 of you? Okay, so this is type, number one here. This is actually set in modern web type. It's Georgia, which is a really familiar typeface. This was built for reading on screen. Georgia has this nice X height. You kind of see the height of these lowercase letters compared with the capitals is really large, all that kind of stuff. This is a modern web font that's in use today. Number two, several of you thought this was number two. This is very much what we associate with the 1920s. It was actually made in the 2000s to be evocative of the 1920s and to be evocative of, you know, this kind of jazz era type stuff, right? Like, I keep reading this as Gatsby. It has a it's sacrificing legibility in service of this kind of Art Deco look, right? Which can be problematic if we want to use this on our sites. This third one is actually all type styles that would have been available in 1922, which is when the story is set. The book was published in 1925. So Globe Gothic, Balmer, and Clear Gothic are all types that would have been available at that time and all things that would have been available at that time. You know, regardless of which three of these that you use, the nice thing about them is all of these things are set in such a way that none of them compromise the legibility or the readability of what's going on. They're all very similar to what you would have seen if it's just purely unstyled. Okay. There's one more test for picking type, and then we're going to start talking about some other things. This is a super useful test to use when you're picking type for your site in terms of legibility, especially for sans serif typefaces. It's the IL1 test. And so the idea is if you take the lowercase I, the L, or the uppercase I, lowercase L, and the number 1, and set them next to one another, can you easily tell which one of these things is which? This leads to legibility. You know, this helps out quite a bit with legibility. Usually, just given the way that we read, we don't really look at individual letters, we look at groups of letters, but this can lead to this can help with confusion quite a bit. Okay, so color and contrast and balance. Color theory is an entire course of study on its own. The idea of how color is made, whether it's additive or subtractive, colors of light, colors of pigment, these are all different things. But for the purposes of this class, keep in mind color will add emphasis to a presentation or draw attention to a single item. Too much color is a lot worse than too little color, right? Like, what am I supposed to be looking at there? It just looks terrible. And color combinations that we use need to complement the information that's presented and not overwhelm the information that's presented. We're going to look at some types, we're going to look at some sites here in a couple minutes that use color well and to emphasize individual things and not other things. So color is a separate thing from value. Value is basically how our eye perceives light and dark, and color plays into this, but it's a separate issue. Our eyes detect this issue of value of the amount of light that's on an object or the amount of light that's emanating from our screens much more easily than we can detect color. This is a photo that has a great deal of value, not because it's Ansel Adams, but because it illustrates this idea. We have extreme blacks and extreme whites in this photo, and we can easily distinguish the difference among those things in the photo. The only place it gets a little bit muddy is in the top right there, right? If we look at this in an example of a color slide or a color photo, you know, again, we see some extra color over here, but the basic shape is unchanged over on the right side. So why am I going on about this stuff? Because it deals with contrast. Contrast is the idea, these desaturated images, the ones that are only in grayscale, give us a really good help in design because they mimic how people with color blindness are able to see our pages and navigate around them. About 8% of men have some form of color blindness. Less than 1% of women do. It's because of how this is carried on the X chromosome, that gene. But there is a portion of the population that can't see things that are in certain colors, and there are degrees of full to partial and whatever else color blindness. So this site, colororacle.org, has a really super useful filter that you can apply to your entire computer, to part of what you're doing to your art, that lets you actually look at how people are able to see your color on different sites and in different areas. So. This is a free color blindness tool, and the way that you use it is you can actually take it and you can kind of see what's going on with it here. This will keep on playing. You can see how this color wheel, which has all the colors in it, desaturates as you go down the page and as you look at different things. So the takeaway here is not design every page as though somebody colorblind is going to be looking at it, but the amount of contrast on your page is way more important than the exact color that you're using to distinguish among different visual elements. And if you have like an orange and then a little bit darker orange and then like a burnt orange and then like a red orange that are all parts of your spectrum that you're trying to distinguish among things, there's a significant number of people who aren't going to be able to tell those subtle differences among those different things that you're using. So how to color. There's 4 primary color classifications. Monochrome colors, monochrome color schemes are different saturation values and hue values of the same thing, right? So these tend to be, they kind of look kind of authoritarian, right? They kind of look a little bit, you know, sort of distant. They tend to look a little bit, you know, severe quite a bit. The analogous colors are ones that are close to one another on the color wheel. So if you look at a color wheel, these are often combinations that are found in nature, right? So you have, you know, grass, dirt, you know, different shades of green leaves, all that kind of stuff that you have going on there. Complementary colors are ones that have quite a bit of contrast. In the color wheel, which is the light spectrum that we use, they're on different sides from one another. They're on exactly opposite sides. They're very clashy, right? They're uniforms of some really terrible sports teams who may have made it to the Super Bowl. They have a bold feel to them because of the fact that they are so contrasty and they're so high in contrast. They're not the choice that you would use if you wanted to make a nice, relaxing, cool sort of a look at a site. And then warm and cool are colors on the spectrum that have feelings of warmth and coolness, right? This green to blue, violet at the end, those are cool colors. Warm colors are, reds, yellows, oranges, more vibrant things. This is more of a qualitative look at this, but the idea being that, there's some stuff that's going to make you feel excited and fired up on the page. There's some stuff that's going to make you feel much more relaxed and much more sort of able to go about your day on a page. So there's this website, colorschemedesigner.com, which is a really good tool at understanding how those work. It includes a release for color blindness. And it actually lets you take a color wheel and experiment with colors that are complementary to one another, that are different from one another, that are close to one another, that are analogous, that are monochromatic, all that kind of stuff. So balance on web pages, we think of balance as a page that's designed that has balance among different elements. What do I mean by that? This page that you're looking at is relatively well balanced because no part of the page is significantly bigger than the other, right? The body type is legible, the headline is there, but it's not going to overwhelm you, it's not going to distract you, it's not going to make you jump between items the way that something like this would be, for example. This is a real common thing that novice designers do, especially with printed pages. They want to make their headline like the biggest possible thing that could be, and they ignore the relationship of that to the body type. And this is really tough. This is like taking your normal set of stairs you use to go upstairs and downstairs and taking like 4 out of the middle and making me jump that far up to or down from getting one of these places to the other. So if you have to have a large headline and a variety of other elements on the page, you want to try to lead readers through it gently. Don't make them jump through those kind of big hoops, those kind of big chunks of text to be able to have that show up. So we talked about this typograph site. This is super useful, and on this small screen, it's not showing up great. But the idea here is that I can take my body text and I can move these things around and actually see what ratios my other stuff needs to be in to be able to be in the right ratio or in the right place here. So I can take my H1, move it here, I can take my H2, move it down here, and it automatically updates for me. For a long time, I just played around with this to look at how different types actually looked. If you actually read the entire thing, it's got some really fantastic tips for how to declare your body size and your font size. And it gets into this theory of relative M's or REMs. It gets into the idea of setting type by the body type and having everything else to be in the body type, in a ratio with the body type. But up here, it will let you look at different scales and different ways of doing your type and ways of doing things. It'll also give you, ta-da, the CSS that you need to be able to actually do these things, which is super useful. I don't show this in my web design class until like later in the semester, so they don't cheat. Okay, so the big thing is content, right? This is really what I should have started with, but it's the type of stuff that you put on your pages. So the question for a lot of people when they are designing portfolio sites is they get very stressed out because everybody needs web skills and HTML and blah, blah, blah. And not everybody has to build a website from scratch and host it on their own server that's running, Linux in the back of their basement or whatever else, right? For the vast majority of people who don't want to be web developers, it is totally fine to have a WordPress site. It's totally fine to have a Blogger site. It's totally fine to have a Wix site. If what you're showcasing is content that is basically based around writing, even if it's based around design, if it's based around print design, if it's based around other things like that, the only people I would ever judge for not having built their own website from scratch if I'm hiring are probably people who I want to build websites from scratch or develop websites from scratch or have that kind of a job, right? So is the content that's on your site, does that align with what you want your users to see? And a lot of content on a lot of sites doesn't. This is what's on a university website versus what people go to the site looking for. Does this look like Mizzou to anybody, right? And of course, we have a campus map that was built by computer science studies students in like 1998, and you can, make it bigger and smaller and all that stuff, right? So we're misaligned in terms of what we want to show on sites versus what people want to actually see on sites. This is kind of a long quote from Matt Gemmell. It's talking about this whole issue, and I'll let you guys kind of read it as I talk through it. For so many of the sites that we built professionally, for so many of the sites that we built to be able to provide content to people, to be able to provide things to read to people, we have taken the message of that content and we've surrounded it by so much crap that you can't even get to the stuff that it is that you want to actually see. This is my favorite quote ever. I couldn't hit the reader button fast enough. Anybody use that in Safari? In fact, I couldn't hit it, and all it's done was by the flickering, colorful circus the page presented, it was like angry fruit salad on meth. It's like the best quote ever. You know, so this is a guy who has the experience of reading stuff on the web. He's there because he wants to read things that are mostly words and text on a page, and you get presented with all this other crap that has nothing to do with what you want to actually do. You know, further on in this piece, he talks about, I think it was the Space Wars or the Merchant Wars. There was this sci-fi thing from the book from the 50s that posited this kind of dystopian future in which people who were poor or did not have the resources to know what they were doing technologically would be constantly pummeled with advertisements everywhere they possibly went, whereas the rich or people who could pay to opt out of that or were smart enough to turn those things off wouldn't be pummeled by those all the time. And we're kind of like in that spot, right? This is Kansas.com, who I feel fine making fun of because Kansas. This is their page, right? This is a page that theoretically has news that I want to read. This is navigation and ads and search bar and weather. Who here has ever gone to a newspaper website to check the weather? You're like, oh, I wonder what the weather's like. I'm going to call up my local newspaper website. Well,
I go to Missourian because it has a different temperature than say KWeb News website or.
well, thank you for your support. We will keep this around because it's like ingrained in managers' heads that we have to have the weather.
Sorry.
But here's this stuff, and I'm not saying that the
I can
branding.
lie if it means you get your real estate back for something else.
No, it's cool.
Okay.
It's small.
Okay.
And I'm not saying that navigation and branding are not important or ads are not important. Like we all like to get paid for the work that we're doing, but the proportion of this that's here versus what we actually read is so small. This is obviously somebody else's website. It's not a professional well, it's a professional publication, but it's not. He's not selling ads on the site. He works as a web designer. The guy who designed this, he did not do this to be able to, sell ads against it. Here's the template and the navigation, the nameplate, and here's the stuff for reading. There's obviously a significant amount of difference between these two things, right? So how do you make a website? The first thing you do is you start sketching on paper, okay? Here's a website that I made to have pictures of cats, because that's what's popular right now, and I'll sell ads and make $1 million. So I start sketching, and this is actually super useful, because like you start doing stuff, and you're like, oh, I'm gonna talk about web design, I know what I'm doing, and I make like 80 slides in Keynote, and I'm like, this is crap, and I throw everything out, and I get so annoyed with myself, whereas if I just like wrote some ideas down, this would have gone much smoother. So you sketch on paper first, and then there's this super useful website called 960.gs, which is bookmarked later on, which lets you download grid paper for this 960 grid that they promote, and it's like a 12-column grid, but you can draw stuff on that. And I can refine my ideas of where cats go and all this kind of thing, and I can start sketching out the metrics for all this. And then I can turn this into something that's a little bit more abstract there, where I say, hey, I'm going to have a 12-column website. I'm going to use 4 primary columns for my navigation. My body of my site is going to be in 3 of those 4 columns, or 9 of the 12, whatever. My other stuff is going to be in this area, and you can actually design this out to be a much smoother and a much more modular way of doing things. This is Khoi Vin's website, Subtraction.com, who was the designer for the New York Times, their website for about a decade. He retired 4 or 5 years ago from that and is doing other stuff. It's extremely grid-based, and he redesigned it literally yesterday. I'm kind of annoyed, like he couldn't have waited until tomorrow and this would still be relevant. But you see that there's content areas here that work within that 8-column grid that are harmonious because they're a fraction of that 8-column grid, but they are only kind of a chunk of a fraction of it, right? So you've got 2 columns for navigation for search, you've got 2 columns for a sidebar, the main text is 4 columns, and they all work because they're in proportion to one another. So this 960.gs is a grid system with sketching paper that is super useful. This is a website, grids.heroku.com, that lets you generate CSS on a variety of sizes and lets you visualize the grid as you're making it. These are all linked from my bookmarks. And Semantic.com is a very cool website that lets you build grids for responsive designs, which would be designs that work on big screens, small screens, everything in between. But it uses Sass, which is not actually just like rolling your eyes, it's a programmatic thing, and Compass, which are advanced CSS techniques to be able to use this. So critiquing a site, the easiest way to find out whether your site works is to show it to a person. Most of you probably know other people, right? If you don't, I'm not sure what you're doing in college. If you show your site to several people, your chance of finding problems with your site increases. In fact, this is the basic principle that we use for usability testing. We take our sites, we show them to people, we give them tasks like, hey, I have an airline website, try to book a flight, and then we see where the process fails. We do this in my class quite a bit. So there's a really common myth about testing like this, that you have to do it in like some big ass environment, it has to be all controlled, and you have to buy food for people, and all this kind of thing, and it takes a lot of time and effort. This is not true. There's a Nielsen Norman group, different from the Nielsen TV people, that do web consulting. They found that with the number of test users that you have, your chance of finding stuff actually goes down over time. 5 users find about 80% of the problems you have on a website. And this makes sense, right? If your search bar doesn't exist, every user is going to find that. You're going to find progressively fewer items with fewer users. So testing with 5 users finds 80% of the problems you could have with your own personal site. You could probably show it to one person and get some feedback and go through and make some changes. The really striking insight of that curve is that testing with no people yields you no insights. Like one person, if you test with one person, you automatically have 100% more information than you did previously about whether your site works or it doesn't work or whatever else. And then I'm going to look at just a couple of these things. Some site design inspiration, and then we'll kind of close, and I'll stick around for a few minutes if there's questions. This is it's going to come up small on this screen. Story about this, SB Nation wrote. SB Nation, or rather Bill Connolly, who's here in town, wrote for SB Nation. SB Nation is part of the Vox media empire, not our Vox, but a different Vox. They are doing some really awesome things on the web right now, and they are hiring. So, you know, what we have here is nice text on a decent width. We have some pull quotes that are kind of nice, and we intersperse this with big photos that are interesting, you know. And as we go through it, we see little chunks of information. You know, we see more big photos. What's nice about this, in my mind, is how it balances out kind of the story of the game. And each of these things is broken up a little bit. We have some smaller images. We have some bigger images. And each of these breaks here is in a logical place, and we have a nice large image that shows up here within this break, you know. And then, you know, as the story ends, we get a couple of other images as we go through here, and we go down to the comments and so on and so forth. This is a really nice way of showing this, of doing a design that is not technically challenging. All this is really nice type. These are just big images. There's none of that like scrolly JavaScript junk that you see on a lot of websites where these are like cards that are flipping up above, you know, above and below one another. It's just nice design and really nice images that are memorable that make this, you know, that make this thing really work. Another website that I want to glance at, Lost World Fairs is very fun. These are, it's not even going to work on the size of the screen. Let's skip that one. I hate doing web design talks when we have these projectors that are only like 1024 wide because it meshes everything down to where you would not want to actually see the thing. Let's take a look at Life and Death of the American Arcade. This is another Vox Media production, another Verge production. What's interesting to me about this is that this is a site that has ads on it, that's doing well, that's selling stuff, and it's an argument against the idea that we have to have a million colors on our site, right? They basically have black, white, and this one red color that they're going to use for links throughout. And they have some background stuff here, and that thing's going to keep popping down and be annoying. But they have some background images, they have some of these larger images, and they do have this little scroll effect, right? So a slide moves here, they have something else that pops up here, and then something else comes in along with it. You know, also an interesting way of dealing with this, obviously on the smaller screen this is not working particularly well, but they're publishing this with these 3 colors, like I said, the black, the white, and then this red color. Some of these larger images, some of them not, but they're publishing this with something that's not tremendously difficult to be able to do. They just have taken a lot of good images of these sites. And then let's close with one more, which I just think is fun, and it's almost dinner time, so everybody's going to get hungry. Just really fun, old school looking typography, right? This is very much this sort of double luck here. They do wild game processing. And then as we roll over this thing, we just get 4 little items that have this same sort of fun, quirky, old school typeface that we have going on. In most places, I would say that mixing this many types of type is kind of a type crime. In this case, it works because what the aesthetic is that they're shooting for is a really kind of fun 50s quirky type of an aesthetic. So that's a very cool one. A couple of other sites that are here we looked at Zeldman's Web Design Manifesto. The Great Discontent is a lovely site that does interviews with creative people. It's very cool. And then, yeah, that's it. So this is my Twitter account. I mostly tweet about sports and chat with friends on it. I don't actually do much journalism stuff on it, but if you want to follow me, that's cool. You know, Amy and I talk sometimes on there. My email address if you have questions for me. And then this last link here is to my Delicious account, which I know is like very like early 2000s, but it still works and it has all my links on it. So anything that's on there with this URL are links to websites that I showed in class today or that I talked about in class today. And that's my username. You can look at my other links if you want to. There's a Rob Weir who works for IBM, and he like totally gloms all the, like whenever there's like a new service and there's like this username land rush, we like compete for that stuff. So that's my alternative username. I would be happy to stick around for questions. I know we're a little bit over time. It's like 7:05. So if you guys need to leave, I totally understand. We're all on a schedule, but I'd be happy to stick around and either answer questions from here or just come up and say hi or whatever. Yes?
First of all, what fonts did you use on the presentation?
What font did I use on the presentation? It's actually a font called, what's it called? It starts with a C, Cecilia. Yeah. Yep. I just found it and I liked it, so why not? Yep. And it's a slab serif, but it works in body styles, which is very cool. So.
I always feel like you talk about photography and visual type, what's kerning? I don't know.
So kerning is often mistaken for tracking. There's two ways to deal with space between things, right? Tracking is the overall length of the line and how squished the letters are together or how spaced out they are together. Kerning is the individual space with the